Today we're going to talk about section 1.3. 1.3 is a relatively short section. It's actually brand new in this edition of the textbook. And so what we're going to talk about today in this section is the data cycle. Right, so as of right now, we have seen some examples of data. We've seen some different types of data. We've talked a lot about context. We've talked about what data is. So now we're going to learn how we want to interact with this data. Right? So the data cycle, right, is a representation of a statistical investigation cycle. Right? The stages that we're going to go through when we're analyzing data. In real life, we may not necessarily go in the order that's listed here. Depending on the type of problem that we're working on, we may be going back and forth between some of these different parts of our cycle. All right, so our first step is listed up at the top here, ask questions. Step 2, consider data. Step 3, analyze data. Step 4, interpret data. Again, the step numbers are kind of loosely numbered, depending on what type of problem we're working through. Again, we may go slightly out of order, we may go back and forth. It just kind of depends on what we're doing. Right, so to look briefly first at our first step is to ask questions. It's important to ask good questions. Good questions are questions that can be answered with data, right? Because we're talking about investigating data. Better questions are questions that address the research topic and increase your understanding of the issues. There's a little typo there, I apologize. Right, then from there we move to step 2. Step 2, we are going to consider our data. Right, we talked in the first section about context. Right, context is key. Right, so as we're going through and we're talking about and thinking about our data, where there's a bunch of things that we want to consider. I kind of look at this as our who, what, when, where, why, how list. Right, who or what was observed, what were the variables measured, how were they measured, how did they collect the data, why did they collect the data, and all of that type of stuff. So just information on our data set that we have been given access to. Right, step 3 is to analyze our data. When we're analyzing our data, we begin by visualizing the data. The analysis of our data is the main focus of this book. And actually in our next chapter, chapter 2, we're going to start and we're going to talk a lot about visualizing data. So we can visualize data in different tables, different graphs, other different types of images, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot in the next chapter. Sometimes visualization is enough to answer our question. Right? So depending on when we're done, maybe our goal is to get a graph to look at, and sometimes we need a little bit more. Right, then our final step is to interpret our data and to interpret our analysis. In other words, we are answering our original question. Right? So we can create a graph of data, but we want to be able to take that graph of data and use that to answer our original question. Right? Or whatever other type of analysis we use. Unless you have done an interpretation, you are not done. And we'll see this as we go through some of the chapters. Specifically, I can think of off the top of my head, starting from chapter 4, chapter 6, 7, and 8. In a lot of these chapters, our last question is going to be asking you to give an interpretation or an explanation. Right? So interpreting our data is definitely a key part of the problem. Right? Just coming up with the graph or the numerical value that we're looking for isn't enough. We want to be able to do a little bit to explain, right, why that's useful and how this answers our question. All right, so we've got one example for this section. Right? In this section, our first example, right, a statistician named James Molyneux compiled data from almost 5,000 movies. The following variables are provided. These aren't necessarily all of the variables, but this is just one particular study, one particular example. And looking at this list of movies, for each movie, we have a title, year, MPAA rating, so rating whether it's PG, R, so on and so forth. Studio, color, so is it color or black and white? Language, country, reviews, audience rating, critics rating, budget, the gross number of income, and then our IMDb ID number. So we've got a couple of different questions here. For question A, which variables would you consider to answer this question? Right, do critics tend to rate movies lower than audience rates them? So if we look in this list of variables, right, if we wanted to answer this question, we're going to need 2 pieces of information. As far as the actual movie title, things like that, that's not really our concern right now. what we're looking at is we're looking at the ratings, right? So we're definitely going to want both our audience rating and our critics rating. Right. So those two pieces of information we should be able to compare, and then we can use that to answer a question. Based on the form of the ratings, we might be doing different types of comparison, but that's going to be the information that we're going to start from. All right, then for example B, determine whether each question can be answered with the data. So our first question here, do critics rate R-rated movies more highly than G-rated movies? Well, looking at this, we're talking about critics rating, and we're talking about the MPAA rating. So could this question be answered with the data? We're going to say it could be answered using the MPAA rating and the critics rating. Again, how we're actually going to do our analysis would be better answered if we actually had our data set in front of us, but by using these two different variables, we could probably answer this question. All right, our next question, are comedies shorter than dramas? In this case, we're not actually told anywhere in our variables about our types of movies. So this one could not be answered. Could not be answered with our data set. Okay. The third question in the list here, do audiences prefer shorter movies over longer movies? Right? So here we're thinking about audience rating or reviews, right? And as far as everything else, we have title, year, MPAA rating, studio, color, language, country, but at no point in this list, right, do we see anything about the length of our movies, right? So this question could not be answered with our data set. Right, we are missing the time, right? How long each movie is. Right, and then the final question here, do movies that have a large budget receive higher audience ratings? This one could be answered. So this could be answered using budget and audience rating. So again, as we're thinking about section 1.3, we're thinking about our data cycle, we're thinking about our 4 steps, asking questions, consider data, analyze the data, interpret the data to actually answer our original question. The types of homework questions that you're going to see, there's only a couple related to section 1.3, and they look very, very similar to this example here down at the bottom.